when I run the video introduction, I'm going to take your screen share off, so you're going to have to turn your screen share back on afterwards.
Okay, well, I can pause it or stop it now. I'll stop it. There you go.
Okay.
There you go.
Good day. I'm Chilton Varner, the president of the Supreme Court Historical Society. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome you to the Society's ongoing virtual lecture series. The Society and its staff have worked hard to adapt as the pandemic seems determined to last forever. While we would love to be holding events in person, we hope you will enjoy these virtual programs which have their own values. For example, they make our programs accessible to a much larger audience than would be the case were we to be, for example, in the Supreme Court building. Another advantage is that virtual programs can be archived permanently on the website, allowing members to watch them at their convenience. Today's virtual lecture features Professor Christopher Rock. His lecture will focus on John Stewart Rock, the first African American to join the Supreme Court bar. Professor Brooks is going to talk for about 40 minutes, and he will then pause to allow our audience, you, to send in questions or comments that you may have arising out of the lecture. Our executive director, Jim Duff, will review and select questions and comments that can be conveyed to our speaker. Now for a few facts about our speaker. Christopher Brooks is a professor of history and geography at East Stroudsburg University, where he earned his BA and his master's degree. His M.Lit was earned from the University of Edinburgh. And finally, last but not least, surely, he earned his doctorate from the University of Kassel. Professor Brooks is the co-author of 2 books on German employment law, the most recent being entitled Expats in Germany, Inbound and Outbound, Questions Frequently Asked by Foreigners. In his spare time, Professor Brooks serves on the Pennsylvania Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. His work in recent years has focused on the subject of today's lecture, John Stewart Rock, and we are honored that he is willing to share his most interesting research with us today. I am delighted to welcome Professor Brooks to the Society's virtual platform. Professor, you now own the floor. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'd like to begin by saying welcome to this talk today on John Stewart Rock's path to Supreme Court bar membership. The focus of today's talk will be on this struggle for Rock to become that first African American member of the bar, but a brief overview of Rock's life and times is necessary to provide context before we get to this 1865 event. So let's start off with who was John Rock. He was born in Ilsenboro, New Jersey in, well, it's debated, 1825 or 1826. More recent records point to 1826. He was born to An emancipated mother, Maria Willett Rock, and free father, John Rock Sr., the younger John Rock, amazingly, becomes a teacher, dentist, physician, and known speaker on abolitionism all by his 27th birthday. He was also a rather well-known Lyceum speaker. And for those of you unfamiliar with the American Lyceum movement of the 19th century, it was, in most simple terms, an adult education trend during Rock's day. Some of the more famous Lyceum speakers included Ralph Waldo Emerson, Abraham Lincoln, and others. And then, of course, Rock will become an attorney in 1861. But let's dig into where Rock was from, because that might help us to better understand the man. Rock was born and raised in Salem County, New Jersey, right around where you see that little red dot there, in this little town of Elsinboro. Now, though geographically below the Mason-Dixon line, as at least part or all of 5 of New Jersey's 21 counties lie, Rock grew up in an area in Salem County which was heavily influenced by abolitionist Quakers, though there was some slavery in the region. Rock finished his schooling in 1844 and was hired immediately thereafter to replace his mentor, Ishmael Locke, as head teacher of the school that he attended. Ishmael Locke was the grandfather of Aline Locke, the first African-American Rhodes Scholar, best known for his work during the Harlem Renaissance. And of Rock's school leadership, there was apparently a lot of good said. In one Salem newspaper, the Daily Standard, David Allen, who was a member of the Salem Society of Friends Education Committee, reported in March of 1847, having been much gratified by a visit to the colored school of this place now, under the charge and direction of John S. Rock, I take pleasure in saying that its excellent arrangement and perfect order and regularity of deportment prevailing among the pupils would do credit to any school whatever. His manner of teaching is highly honorable. To his skill in imparting instructions and the performance of scholars, particularly in lessons on geography, spelling, arithmetic, scripture, and recitation, bear testimony to his own faithfulness, as well as to their good progress under his care. It cannot but be the earnest wish of any who have witnessed their interesting exercises that all the members of this school may go on to improve their present opportunities in the conduct of their lives as to become worthy and useful members of this community. So apparently it was quite the successful school director and teacher. What you see in front of you is a picture of the current Salem Society of Friends meeting house, and the school was located across the street, a wooden structure which unfortunately no longer stands. So Rock, in the other pursuits of his life, he applied to study medicine and was rejected due to his race. So he decided to apprentice to become a dentist under a man named Samuel Harbert, who was a prominent man of dentistry, well known for his work, a practical treatise on the operations of surgical mechanical dentistry. And in fact, the office in Salem, New Jersey, where Rock apprenticed, is the current Salem County Historical Society's building, same building. In 1849, Rock would open his own dentistry office at 288 Lombard in Philadelphia. And a couple of years later, he would win a silver medal for dentures he made in a competition of dental professionals. And eventually, 1850, while practicing dentistry, a few things happened. One, he wins the battle and is eventually admitted to study medicine and completing those studies in 1852. And he would also become director of the evening program of what would later become Cheyney University. In 1852, Rock moved with his wife, he married, Catherine Bowers, to Boston. So we have to ask ourselves, of course, why Boston? On Beacon Hills, the Beacon Hills section of Boston, which if you're looking at this map in front of you, to the left in pink, you see the yellow highlighted part where Southwark is. That is now called Phillips Street, and Rock resided at 81 Southwark, now Phillips Street. There's a marker in front of his house today. Rock fit right in amongst the other so-called black Brahmins, such as fellow physician John V. DeGrasse and the attorney under whom he would apprentice, Robert Morris. Robert Morris was relatively well known, actually quite well known, in fact. Morris in his own right was an accomplished attorney, is said to be the one of the first African-American lawyers in the country, the second in Massachusetts, perhaps even the second in the United States. And I recently discovered he may have been the first African-American received by the Pope. But that's a discussion perhaps for another day. In 1854, we see this advertisement, which tells us something that Rock not only practiced medicine, but also continued to practice dentistry after moving to Boston. And this leads us to the letters between Rock and another famous Bostonian, the senator and avid abolitionist, Charles Sumner, pictured to the left of John Rock here in this slide. Sumner is probably best known for his having been beaten nearly to death by South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks in 1856, injuries which actually took the senator a few years to recover from. In an 1856 letter about this event on behalf of the Boston Abolitionist Vigilance Committee, John Rock wrote to Sumner that Senator Sumner was, quote, a soldier of truth, there who hath sealed thy testimony with thy blood. This would be the first of several exchanges between Rock and Sumner, but let us now focus on those specific to Rock becoming the first African-American member of the Supreme Court bar. And the first of those letters we find was from December 30th, 1863. And the first thing established is that Rock had visited Sumner at some point. The details of that visit and what they discussed is not specifically addressed. Likely from Philadelphia because of the time of year and his wife's family being from Philadelphia. I believe that's where he was writing from. Rock writes, if it is possible to be admitted to the U.S., to the Supreme Court of the U.S., should prefer to have it come before I return to Boston. Sumner never replied to this letter. For those of you familiar, it takes there's a 3-year period of good standing before someone could be admitted as a member of the bar, good standing in their own jurisdiction, in their own state. So that 3-year period had not yet passed. Rock was admitted in September, I believe September 14th of 1861. So we had a while to wait. So I'm really curious if any records can be unveiled at some point, what that discussion between Rock and Sumner actually was when they met at Sumner's home. So February 9th, 1864, Rock writes to Sumner, "Will you let me hear from you soon?" And then we get to question, was Sumner waiting for something? The focus may have been on the gentleman to your right, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney of Maryland, and the infamous Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott opinion, which had been issued, 7 years earlier, opined that Black Americans had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. So to put it mildly, this is quite the legal and cultural hurdle to traverse. We'll get into this more as we move on. December 17th, 1864, in this letter, we know now by that point, Chief Justice Taney had passed away in October of 1864, and President Lincoln replaces Taney with Salmon P. Chase of Ohio. Of Chase being a jurist known for having defended runaway slaves whilst practicing law in Cincinnati. Rock complimented that the court has, quote, a great and good man for our Chief Justice. About a week later, Sumner and Chief Justice Chase correspond on the matter of John S. Rock. Sumner writes, "Mr. Rock is an estimable lawyer who is daily recommended by Governor Andrew and others in the public service." Chase writes, "There are no serious objections." On Christmas Eve, 1864, Rock writes, "Sumner, many thanks to you for your kind intercession on my behalf. I shall leave it all to you. I feel it to be a great personal favor as well as great triumph to succeed in this effort." January 6, 1865. Rock's haste did not please the Chief Justice, instructing Sumner that advice to Mr. Rock to wait until he heard definitely from you was advice he should have regarded. And the risk here is traveling to Washington, D.C. And the reason there was a risk for any African American, slave or free, to travel south of Mason-Dixon line was that freedom papers were needed. And the freedom papers, here's a sample pictured here, with the kind that Rock would have needed to travel to and from the South. As the now well-known story of Solomon Northup in 12 Years a Slave, the film has made plain, those papers were not always respected. Thus, the risk was all Rock's to bear in such travel. January 15th, 1865, Sumner. Regards to John S. Rock, Counselor at Law, Massachusetts. What say you? Nothing at present, except not forgotten, Chase replies. January 15th, 1865, Chase writes, I mentioned that I was informed that motion for admission to the bar of a colored lawyer from Massachusetts would be made, and asked advice. No one inclining to speak, I said I would take silence as indicating willingness to leave the matter to my discretion as Chief Justice, intimating that I should admit without hesitation. Then one after another, nearly all expressed the opinion that the rule must govern, that in it there was no disqualification on the ground of color. He continues, one queried as to citizenship. And I said I would direct the motion to be made for admission and have it argued. But this not being insisted on, we adjourned with the understanding that colored men qualified could be admitted without regard to complexion. Progress. So, the query into citizenship, per the Dred Scott decision, Blacks neither were nor were ever meant to be citizens, slaver-free. They were intended to be slaves in his estimation and the estimation of many states and people at the time. So that leads us to some other questions. Who were the justices Chase needed to convince? And what was his progress about which he spoke? I'm going to show you a picture here, and I'm going to go from left to right and explain the challenges that Chase would have encountered. So starting with the clerk of the court, D.W. Middleton, he owned slaves. In fact, he owned 6 of them. Then, not that he had too much of a say, but then there were Justices Robert Greer, James Wayne, and Samuel Nelson, who had all concurred or agreed fully with Tawney and Dred Scott. And, and for the men not on the Tawney court, there's Nathan Clifford, who was considered a doughface or a northerner with southern sympathies. And that left Chief Justice Chase and Associate Justices Miller and Stephen Field as perhaps being the only full-throated supporters of Rock's admission. We will never know exactly what was said in conference, but based on what we do know, Chase is tasked to convince his fellow justices to support Senator Sumner's motion to have Rock admitted to become the first African-American member of the Supreme Court bar could not have been an easy one. And let's talk about this further challenge, actually. To highlight it further, take a quick look at Associate Justice John Catron of Tennessee, who was not in that picture on the previous slide. He was the 10th justice. I should quickly note that it wasn't until 1869 that the court has settled on 9 justices, and that hasn't changed since. Catron was a slave owner. He had sided with the state sovereignty argument in Dred Scott. In fact, the case had originated in Catron's circuit. To illustrate Catron's thinking from when he had been the chief judge of the Tennessee State Court. He argued in a dispute over ownership of a slave that the mutual feelings of dependence, affection, and humanity existing between master and slave have no cash price and cannot be compensated in money. This, I believe, shows the depth of the institution of slavery and defenses for it. Perhaps we can touch upon that further during the Q&A. But let's return now to Rock, Chase, and Sumner. January 23rd, 1865. Chase wrote to Sumner, "You can make your motion for Mr. Rock's admission at any time which suits your convenience." A few days later, Rock confirmed receipt of the good news and indicated that he would be traveling to Washington City so that the motion may be made Thursday next, which would have been February 2nd, 1865. Rock promised not to speak of the matter, but shared in this letter to Senator Sumner that he'd been asked what would he do, what would Rock do if he weren't admitted, and he replied, "I might apply sometime when I have more time." And then further stated that he and Sumner will take them by surprise after all. That leads us to February 1st, 1865. And on that day, not only was Rock admitted to the Supreme Court bar, but President Lincoln submitted to the state legislators the proposed 13th Amendment of the US Constitution, the amendment which ultimately ended slavery in the United States of America. And the account of the event whereby Rock is admitted to the Supreme Court bar, I'll read. "As soon as the judges had taken their seats, Mr. Sumner rose and with Mr. Rock standing by his side, said, 'May it please the court, I ask leave to present John S. Rock, Esquire, a counselor at law of the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, and now move that he be admitted as a counselor of this court.' The Chief Justice bowed and said, 'Let him come forward and take the oath.' The oath was then administered by Mr. Middleton, clerk of the court. And as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Middleton had been a slave owner, and by one account, he was not particularly pleased with having to administer that oath. Francis Bird, editor of the Boston Commonwealth, reported that Mr. Middleton, quote, studiously averted his face from Mr. Rock, looking only towards Mr. Balch, who was the personal secretary of Sumner. I do not wonder, for it must have been a bitter pill for Middleton to administer the oath under those circumstances to a colored counselor at law. The slave power, which received its constitutional death blow yesterday in Congress, rides this morning on account of the admission of a colored lawyer, John S. Rock of Boston, as a member of the bar of the Supreme Court of the United States. The rage depicted in the countenances of some of the old hunkers present at this invasion of their citadel beggars description. Charles Warren wrote in his history of the court accepting Rock buried Dred Scott, which is true in some ways, in others perhaps not so much. I want to close with Rock's trip home which hopefully I can wrap up in about 5 minutes. He purchased a ticket to travel back to Boston via Baltimore. The ticket agent refused passage because he lacked a valid travel pass. It's not a freedom pass, a travel pass. And I'll get to that. Rock showed his certificate of admission to the Supreme Court bar. The agent rejected it as fraudulent, which, given the way the world was at the time, would be very difficult to believe. And so that requires Rock to visit the enrollment office. Now, per the 1863 Conscription Act, these draft enrollment offices were created to enroll draft eligible males, see that deserters were arrested, ensure draftees reported for military service, et cetera, et cetera. So that begs the question, about why Rock was stopped in the first place, because it turned out he wasn't enrolled in DC. Provost Marshal gives him a pass, authorizing him to leave the district, certifying that Rock was not evading military service. And some authors have intimated that this was because of racial animus. There's loads of things in John S. Rock's life which were due to racial animus, and there probably was some of that here, but this was required of all draft eligible males. So, in any event, Rock does make it back to Boston, but the very unfortunate part is that John S. Rock died of tuberculosis at the end of 1866, tragically never being able to argue a case before the Supreme Court. But his legacy, this struggle to even be accepted by the court during the time which he was doing it, is definitely a story worth telling. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Professor Brooks. Thank you for the fascinating look at John Stewart Rock and his background and history. We're going to be taking questions from the audience now. And if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A section. We'll get to as many of those as possible. On a personal note, I know I went to the University of Edinburgh too, so I'm glad to hear that in your background, Professor Brooks.
Yeah.
How did you get started working on Dr. Rock?
Footnote. He was a footnote. He was an explanatory footnote, and then I started digging and realizing how.
Answers.
Hello, can you hear me?
I'm sorry. I think.
Hello. The other microphone is muted.
I can't hear his answer. Not muted.
Yeah, the other microphone is muted.
Let's see.
I'm not sure why. Right now. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
We
Hello?
try.
Test 1 2. Hello.
Let's try again, Chris.
Okay.
Are you muted?
No.
Oh, I'm beginning to hear it.
Can you
now.
hear me now?
I did hear. I heard it when you leaned over.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, just do without the headset. John Rock was a footnote. He was an explanatory footnote, and I started digging into this further and realizing that most of the work on him was really encyclopedic in nature, with the exception of a few publications. At the time when he came to my attention, there's one book written by Harlan Busby, actually a retired dentist from Salem, New Jersey, who I've come to know, and he's been very helpful in getting me familiar with the society and down there and the records and also some of the locations where Rock may have resided. And there's actually one article in the Supreme Court Historical Society's journal from 1976, I think it was by a man named Professor Conte, Contee. That's the only, in sense, a few articles have come out, but there really isn't a deep contextualized historical treatment of Rock's life. As was touched upon in my introduction, I got sidetracked in the world of transatlantic trade and employment law and other things of that sort. So this project got sidetracked for several years. And over the past few years, at the urging of a few great organizations, I started digging into this a lot more and hoping to get a sabbatical to do more still.
Oh, we're very, very glad you did get the research started on him, and that's a very interesting presentation today. How did he get from dentistry to law? What was the training?
Yeah, so this is part of it because of the time constraints I actually kept out of the presentation. So the records that we have indicate that he had an illness which required him to travel to France for surgery. Now, I mentioned DeGrasse, the other African-American physician in Boston, who arrived around the same time as Rock in Boston. He studied medicine under a man named Velpeau, Alfred Velpeau, Velpeau. Now, Velpeau was, by the name, French. So that meant that, of course, that DeGrasse studied in France. So there is nothing to my knowledge on this relation between Velpeau and African Americans yet written. Again, hoping for the opportunity to explore that further. But what we do know is that Rock did eventually get surgery after a real struggle to get a passport. And Sumner, one of the letters I did not touch upon, or that relationship, Sumner intervened. The state of Massachusetts ended up passing a law that the state legislature passed a law saying that race would not be an issue in issuing passports. So it really was the issue of the passport there. Oh, in any event, Rock goes to France, comes back. This is 1858. He was there for about 10 months. Upon his return, you'd been told, hey, you can't practice medicine. There are certain things with tuberculosis having to do with dexterity that are impacted, and having dug a little bit into Velpeau, it appears that he was one of the few surgeons in the world performing these surgeries. But I'm still trying to prove that 100%. But based on what I have seen, complications due to tuberculosis led to Rock not being able to practice medicine anymore. And at that juncture, he decided to apprentice under Robert Morse.
Interesting. Are there any cases we know of that John Rock argued in the, say, the Massachusetts courts or Massachusetts Supreme Court that you would recommend?
Yeah, that's I started on that venture and hope to complete it to this date. I don't know of any. He was admitted as a magistrate actually 2 weeks after being admitted to the Massachusetts bar in 1861. So it would have been, low-level stuff, acting as a notary public and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I haven't been able to dig into those records. I know that the Suffolk County, Massachusetts archives have those records located in 4 different places throughout Massachusetts, and they're by plaintiff name. So it would, I look, it may be my retirement project because that's going to take a minute. But to date, we don't have anything definitively talking about any cases, although there is some record of legal briefs that in Rock's hand. That we do have, but very few.
Do we know if any African Americans applied to be members of the Supreme Court bar under Taney, or was
not to my knowledge? Rock was the first and clearly the most persistent.
Yeah.
I don't think, because at the time you got Macon B. Allen. There were only about 4 or 5 African American lawyers. 5, 6. Well, 65. A little over half dozen, say around, give or take, around a half dozen African American lawyers at the time in various states. One, the name escapes me right now, actually went off to Ghana to practice law. But none of them, to my knowledge, applied for the SCOTUS bar.
What was the concern keeping his travel quiet? Was it the fear of racial violence, or there was timing in it? And then Chief Justice Chase, as you described, sort of was waiting, it seemed, for the right time. But there must have been a combination of factors at play there, because it sounds as though Chase was amenable to it, but it was a matter of timing. Is that a fair description?
I think that is a fair description. I think that based on the record, my interpretation of it is that Sumner simply wanted to make sure he had all his ducks in a row. First of all, unanimous agreement by the members of the court.
Yeah.
If you think about, what did Earl Warren go through for Brown versus Board, right?
Right.
As a sort of more well-known example. And I think that definitely played a role. As far as the travel, I think a lot of it is, if you're going to travel, let's make sure that this is going to happen, that we have all our ducks in a row.
Yeah. Do you know if there was a relationship with Belva Lockwood? She was the first woman to be admitted to the Supreme Court bar and argue before the Supreme Court.
Belva Lockwood, I believe, was admitted in 1879.
Oh.
And I know that there's a picture floating around the internet of it claims that is of John Rock, counselor of law. The African American in that image, that sketch, is of Samuel Lowry, who was admitted in 1881. My memory serves me correctly. I don't know of any relationship whatsoever between Belva Lockwood and Rock, though.
No. Was she from Massachusetts? I don't think.
I think New York.
Yeah. I don't think she was.
I'd have to double check that myself. I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah.
I do know she got into what is now American or George Washington University. I think American. And that was quite a struggle. But her story is maybe for another time.
Well, what were some of the more useful resources in your research on Rock?
What were some of the, could you repeat that?
What were some of the more useful resources or sources in your
Okay.
research on rock?
I started with biographical dictionaries that you find in the primary sources section of the library. And then I started looking through databases to see what had been written, WorldCat, seeing what books, if any, had been published. And then I started looking at, after seeing what was there and realizing that most of it was encyclopedic in nature, I realized that someone had to look at the primary sources. And one thing I've done was go through about 15, no, more than that. Yeah, about 17 or 18 years of newspapers from the Salem County Archives, which I will say are not in digital form, nor are they indexed. So you have to read every word. That took a few years. So I have pages and pages of notes on that, which were very instructive because it gives us a fuller picture of what Rock's world was. Of course, there are secondary sources on various regions, but having this firsthand account, primary evidence of what that experience was in South Jersey, I think is really telling.
It must have been fascinating to dig into and recognize what it took for him to pursue it in the way he did. How would you, one of our questions from the audience was, how would you rank his accomplishments in today's society? And how, is there anyone we could compare him to? I mean, he certainly deserves more recognition than he may have received yet, but we're grateful that you've are working on that.
Who in today's society might Rock be best compared to? Oof. So currently living. Wow. I would venture to say something between Clarence Thomas and Senator Booker of New Jersey. Probably a cross between the two. Yeah, that's the best I can do.
Very interesting. So,
I'd say probably more Thomas than Booker, although it's the similarities with both men.
Another question, thank you for that. Another question we received is it possible to know how many attorneys of color there were in the United States at the time Rock applied to the Supreme Court bar? Is there been anyone prior to him who may have sought to join the bar but was rejected?
So we kind of touched on that question already. I don't believe anybody had applied and been rejected. And I think at the time, he was, based on my count, the 9th attorney of African-American attorney in the United States ever. I believe he was the 4th in Massachusetts history. So
well, this has been
one of the first, yeah.
This has been great. We're very grateful for your time and the questions we received from the audience, and it's just been very illuminating, and we appreciate it, Professor Brooks.
Thank you.
We do have, I would recommend his book that's available from our society's gift shop, www.supremecourthistory.org. And the society's virtual programs will continue in February and March. We're glad to be able to present these on video like this, and it's been of great help to us in our outreach to reach a broader audience and not just in-person programming in Washington. We've launched a series on civics and American democracy. We hope you're tuning in for that. Our next speaker in that series is going to be Kim Lane Shepley, a professor from Princeton, who's going to be speaking on the importance of an independent judiciary and a functioning democracy on February 22nd at 7 p.m. And reservations are now open on the Society's website at www.supremecourthistory.org for Professor Shepley's talk. And separately on March 8th at noon, Walter Starr will be speaking on his new biography of Chief Justice Salmon Chase, whom Professor Brooks has eliminated.
That one. I think I'm already registered.
Thank you. I hope you'll join us for that one too. Yeah. Registration will open for that event next week. And a reminder to our listeners that a survey will go out later today to everyone who registered in advance. We do encourage you to respond to that. We want to make these programs as accessible and enlightening as possible. And we're very grateful to Professor Brooks and joining us and helping us in this series of presentations. Thank you all very much for joining us, and we are adjourned.
Thank you.